Hello everybody. This time we're going to speak about the 19th century Britain. The 19th century marked the highest point in Britain's economic, political and cultural development. That was the time of the British summer. But the beginning of the century was quite a turbulent period because at the end of the 18th century, the wars of the French Revolution turned into the Napoleonic Wars as Napoleon Bonaparte took over the French government. The war caused a boom in farm production and in certain industries, but at the same time it caused rapid inflation, and in 1797 the Bank of England was forced to stop payment of gold for paper currency, and Parliament voted the first income tax. The war did not go well for Britain. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had to form 4 coalitions. 3 of them collapsed, and Napoleon was planning to invade Britain. It was Admiral Nelson's victory in the dramatic Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 that prevented the invasion. The battle was won at the price of Nelson's life, but the French forces never stepped on the British soil. Admiral Nelson was buried in Westminster Abbey, and the column set up in Trafalgar Square in the centre of London is topped with a bronze statue of the national hero. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 led to the 4th coalition, which brought together the armies of Britain, Russia, Austria and Prussia. Britain's contribution included an army led by the Duke of Wellington, who fought in Spain and later won the Battle of Waterloo. Wellington proved to be a capable commander early in the war. Unlike the majority of the officers of the Allied forces, he did not believe either in the genius of Napoleon himself or in the invincibility of his army. Wellington insisted that Napoleon usually won his victories largely due to the psychological effect produced by his army and by his personality. On his appointment as commander of the British Army, Wellington wrote about the French. "I am not afraid of them. I suspect that all the continental armies were more than half beaten before the battle was begun. I, at least, will not be frightened beforehand." At the beginning of March 1815, the Emperor Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France. He reformed his army with astonishing speed and was determined to conquer Holland as the first move in rebuilding his empire. The representatives of the allied European countries that met at the Congress of Vienna mobilized their armies to stop him, but only 2 armies could be brought to Flanders at the time. The Prussian army, commanded by Marshal Blucher, and a mixed army of British, Dutch and German troops under the command of the Duke of Wellington. They were all divided in their languages, loyalties and experience, so it was largely due to Wellington's military talent that the Allied forces defeated Napoleon at Waterloo in Belgium on the 18th of June, 1815. The Battle of Waterloo brought about Napoleon's downfall, and the name of Wellington, who is rightly considered as a national hero like Nelson, got into the English language thanks to the high boots he used to wear. In modern English, the word Wellingtons or Willies means high rubber or plastic boots. At the beginning of the century, Britain enlarged its colonial territories and added to the empire the former Dutch possessions of Ceylon and the Cape of Good Hope. In the 1820s, Prime Minister Robert Peel turned his attention to the problem of crime by establishing a regular police force for London in 1829. The government employed a specially trained army of men to catch criminals. And although at first Londoners laughed at his blue uniformed men in their top hats, during the next 30 years, almost every other town and country started a police force of their own. The new police units soon proved themselves successful, as much crime was pushed out of larger cities, then out of towns, and finally out of the countryside. Robert Peel was able to show that certainty of punishment was far more effective than cruelty of punishment. It was after his name, Robert, Bob or Bobby, that London policemen were nicknamed Bobbies. The beginning of the century also saw the innovations of Robert Owen, a factory owner from Scotland, who gave his workers shorter working hours and encouraged trade unions. Owen built his factory in the countryside, away from the smog and dirt of the big cities, and provided good housing for workers and a school for their children. Owen was able to prove that his workers produced more goods in less time than those who were forced to work longer hours. Better working and living conditions resulted in an increase in labor productivity. Owen's ideas and example were supported and put into life by other reformers such as Arthur Cadbury, the owner of the famous Birmingham chocolate factory, who built first-class housing for workers. The main political issue of the 1830s was the Reform Bill, which became law in 1832. The bill set up a system of registration that encouraged political party organization, both locally and nationally. That measure weakened the monarch and the House of Lords, but it strengthened Parliament. Other reforms came in a quick succession. In 1833, slavery was abolished. By the new Poor Law of 1834, workhouses were opened. Workhouses were meant to provide the homeless people with work and shelter. Abandoned children were also taken care of in workhouses. But although the new system involved supervision by a special central board or committee, working and living conditions for people in workhouses were even worse than those of slaves. Very often families were divided. As the country's industry was rapidly developing, child labor became common practice. Children from poorer families started working at the age of 4 or 5. They worked mostly in textile factories and in mines for 16 hours a day. There were cases when little workers had to stay at work even for 18 hours, and they worked and slept in the same place. But the worst fate was of those children who worked as chimney sweeps. They seldom lived to become adults. It was only in 1849, during the reign of Queen Victoria, that an Act of Parliament limited the working hours of children under the age of 10 to 10 hours a day. In 1836, a special law placed the registration of births, deaths, and marriages in the hands of the state rather than the church. But all attempts on the part of the state to influence and subsidize education were strongly opposed by the church. During the economic depression of 1837, the reform spirit declined and working conditions became even worse. And protest organizations known in history as the Chartist movement came into being. The Chartists demanded the immediate adoption of the People's Charter, which might have transformed Britain into a political democracy with universal male suffrage. They demanded equal electoral districts and the secret ballot. It was also, the Charter was also expected to improve living standards. Millions of workers signed the Charter petitions in 1839, 1842, and 1848. Some Chartist demonstrations turned into riots, but Parliament repeatedly rejected the People's Charter and the idea was never realized. Now let us speak about Romanticism in English literature. In the 1820s, Britain welcomed the independence of Spain's South American colonies and aided the Greek rebellion against the Turkish rule. The events in Greece were praised and supported by Romantic writers and poets. Extending from about 1789 until 1837, the Romantic age stressed emotion over reason. In English literature, the Romantic age was characterized by the subordination of reason to intuition and passion, as well as the cult of nature, much as the word is understood now. Individual will was considered to be superior to social norms of behavior, and immediate experience was more important than generalized and typical experience. The first Romantics were the poets William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Wordsworth adored and idealized the countryside and nature.
My heart leaps up.
My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety.
Another Romantic poet and novelist was Sir Walter Scott. At the beginning of his literary career, he wrote poetry, and after the publication of the poem The Lay of the Last Minstrel in 1805, Scott became the most famous poet of Scotland. Later, though, he turned to novels. Walter Scott is known as the founder of the historical novel in English literature. Walter Scott was a faithful son of Scotland and studied the past of his native land through documents, history, and legends. His most famous novels are Ivanhoe, Rob Roy, and Quentin Durward. When his business partner died, leaving Scott to pay off the debts, the writer had to start working day and night, practically without sleep. And that explains the fact why Scott's later novels are less elaborately worked out than the earlier ones. Unlike Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Scott, the next generation of the Romantic poets were full of revolutionary spirit. George Gordon, Lord Byron, exemplifies a personality in tragic revolt against society. Byron was born to an aristocratic family and was educated at Harrow College. The boy was not very tall and, what is more, he was lame. That is why he gave much of his time to sports in order to compensate for his physical deficiency. He also traveled a lot, both in England and on the continent. When his first book of poems, Hours of Idleness, was published in 1807, he was bitterly criticized in the press, but that did not stop him. He retorted with an epigram and continued writing. Byron traveled a lot, both in England and on the continent. From 1809 to 1811, he traveled in Portugal, Spain, Turkey, and Greece. The earliest fruits of his travels were the first two cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which were published in 1812. The poem brought him immediate success and established his reputation as the great poet of England. Childe Harold's Pilgrimage is partially autobiographical. The hero is a disillusioned rebel demanding absolute personal freedom, who quickly became the symbol of the vanguard literary thought in Europe. Byron let his hero travel from country to country, filling the poem with vivid descriptions and satirical remarks. Between 1813 and 1816, Byron wrote Oriental Tales, which included 4 pieces. In 1816, he left England, and up to 1823, he lived in Switzerland and Italy, where he at first supported and then joined the Carbonari movement. He wrote 2 more cantos of Childe Harold, Manfred, and the most famous of his poems, Don Juan, which was not finished. In the 1820s, Byron got particularly interested in the struggle of Greece against Turkey. He financed the buying of medicines and arms for the Greeks, and then joined them in person. He participated in the defense of the fortress of Missolonghi, and it was there that he went down with fever and died. Well, this is Byron's grave. Byron produced a tremendous impact on Pushkin, Lermontov, Goethe, and other European poets. They translated and imitated Byron's poems. Pushkin described Онегин as «Москвич в Гарольдовом плаще», вторым Онегин Чайльд Гарольдом, and Byron's poem «My Soul is Dark» was wonderfully translated by Lermontov. The Romantic movement was also reflected in art. Landscape painting especially acquired new importance, notably in Britain, and its greatest exponents were among the leaders of Romanticism. It was the time of the great English artists John Constable and William Turner. They are both famous for their landscapes, but Turner is especially known for his remarkable light effects. Sketching all over Europe during a long life, Turner produced a succession of watercolors and oil paintings of great subtlety and power. And Constable reinvented the medium of oil paint as a vehicle for his personal sensations in front of English rural scenery. And though his painting met with little success at the Royal Academy exhibitions, his idea of making art from direct observation of nature managed to bring profound changes to painting later in the 19th century. Unlike Constable, Turner was hugely successful in his own time, partly because his works basically corresponded to the prevailing academic theory that in art, landscape should be transformed by the artist's imagination. Turner is often called the first impressionist in Europe. And definitely he is the first impressionist in English painting. His extraordinary use of color and light and his dramatic innovations in the painting of stormy seas and effects of weather made him controversial throughout his career. Other artists set out to explore the inner world of the mind. William Blake set out to explore the inner world of the mind. He developed a whole private mythology to investigate the meaning of human life and its place in God's creation. Blake was a poet, an artist, a professional engraver, and a mystic. His early works, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, although they were romantic, were never free from symbolism, and some of his poems were published only in the early 20th century. Most of his books were self-illustrated. Now listen to Blake's poem, The Garden of Love.
The Garden of Love.
I went to the Garden of Love and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and "Thou shalt not" writ over the door. So I turned to the garden of love that so many sweet flowers bore. And I saw it was fitted with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds, and binding with briars my joys and desires.
During the Victorian age, and we're now going to speak about Victorian age. So during the Victorian age, the British Empire reached its height and covered about a fourth of the world's land. This is the empire map. Industry and trade expanded rapidly. Railways and canals crossed the country. Science and technology made great advances. The size of the middle class grew enormously, and by the 1850s, more and more people were getting an education. In addition, the government introduced democratic reforms. Let us have a closer look at Victoria and Victorians. By the late 1830s, the monarchy was beginning to look a disreputable and even unnecessary institution. Kings were expected to rule, but they were unable to do that. They were basically expected to reign only. And from this low point, the monarchy was rescued by Queen Victoria, one of the most notable figures in British royal history. This is a true photo of Queen Victoria, advanced in years already. Victoria came to the throne in 1837 and reigned until her death in 1901. Her achievement was restoring respect and usefulness to the crown, and then going further by becoming the symbol of the nation. Victoria first learned about her future role during a history lesson when she was 10 years old. The future queen reacted to the discovery by standing up and declaring, "I will be good." She took an active interest in the policy of her ministers. Her relations with Prime Ministers Peel and Disraeli were excellent, but she was not on very good terms with Prime Ministers Palmerston and Gladstone. The Queen's conscientious approach to her duties did much to raise the reputation of the monarchy. One should never forget about the impact of Victoria's private life on the country's policy. In 1839, she fell in love with her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. They were married in February 1840, and Albert soon developed a keen interest in governing his new country. Prince Albert served as his wife's private secretary, and being an active patron of the arts and sciences, he was the prime organizer of the Great Exhibition of 1851. Albert also favored the expansion of education, and he served as Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. He became a great champion of strengthening and modernizing Britain's armed forces. But though Prince Albert was respected by most of his new countrymen, he was not loved. Many resented him only because he was a foreigner. But for Victoria, her husband represented perfection, and the two were very happy together. The royal couple offered an example of family life that contrasted sharply with the images of the previous British monarchs. They took an intense personal interest in the upbringing of their children and enjoyed a private family life. Victoria partly owed her success to the fact that she possessed shrewd common sense and high principles. In many ways, the Queen was a very contradictory person. She idolized family life, but she felt uncomfortable in the presence of little children. She had no interest in social issues, and yet the 19th century Britain was an age of reform. She resisted technological change at the time when technological innovations reshaped the face of European civilization. And a lot of technological innovations came from Britain. Most significantly, Victoria was a queen determined to retain political power. And yet unwillingly she contributed to the transformation of the monarch's political role into a ceremonial one, and in that way she managed to preserve English monarchy. In a period when middle-class values were of greatest importance, Victoria embodied the qualities that the middle class most admired: devotion to family and friends, integrity and reliability. Everything that was summed up in the word respectability. Today, we use the word Victorian not only in the meaning of old-fashioned, but we use it also to characterize efficiency, high morals, and good business practice. But Victoria's most important asset was her devotion to the nation. Even when she became an elderly woman, she continued to execute her duties. Victoria early became a widow as Prince Albert died of typhoid fever in 1861. The Queen wanted to retire from public life completely, but the sense of duty and responsibility made her emerge from retirement to perform her royal duties. In the last 20 years of her reign, she became as completely loved and idolized as Elizabeth I had been. Victoria was often called the grandmother of Europe because by her children's marriages she was related to every royal house of Europe. Now let us turn to home and foreign policy. And again, we need the empire map. In the 19th century, the British Empire was constantly expanding and reforming its political relations with old colonies. In 1837, there was a rebellion in Canada. That led to working out the system of self-government for Canada. And in 1855, a similar system was applied to the other two territories, colonial territories with white population, Australia and New Zealand. Later, Prime Minister Gladstone became convinced that there should be home rule for Ireland and even introduced a bill in Parliament in April 1886. But the bill was lost, and the idea was never realized. The British Empire managed to acquire new territories in various regions of the world. Particularly successful was the conquest of India. Due to internal disputes, India's rulers found themselves completely unprepared for a well-elaborated British invasion, and it was Prime Minister Disraeli and his government that gave Queen Victoria the title of Empress of India in 1877. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 and the purchase of a half share in the enterprise aroused British interest in the affairs of Egypt and the Sudan. In fact, the British government did not have any elaborated policy towards Africa until the end of the century. They did not want extra territories to administer at great costs. Much of the exploration of Africa was left to private individuals, missionaries and businessmen. David Livingstone, a Scottish missionary, explored much of East and Central Africa, and Cecil Rhodes, also an explorer, a businessman and a settler, aimed to establish a great empire for Britain in Africa and to build a railroad from Cairo to the Cape. British influence was similarly extended to Nigeria, Kenya, and Uganda through private companies. The situation in the Near East was also far from being stable. There were serious collisions between the Russian and British empires about the control over the territory of Afghanistan. Neither of the two succeeded in conquering the country, but a very bitter feeling remained, and it affected the relations between Russia and Britain. When I'm going to speak about the Crimean War and then later about the Boer War, Britain's only war with a great power in the 19th century was the Crimean War with Russia. It lasted from 1854 to 1856 and was aimed at the reduction of Russian influence in the Balkan region. The war revealed that the British army was very insufficient compared to other European armies. The most important battles were fought at Alma, Balaclava, and in Kerman. The first Victoria Crosses were awarded during the Crimean War. The siege and defense of Sebastopol brings to the Russian mind the names of Admirals Kornilov, Nakhimov, and the first Russian nurse, Dasha Sevastopolskaya, or Darya Mikhailova. To the English mind, it brings the name of Florence Nightingale, the first English nurse. Her work in organizing field hospitals in the Crimea pioneered modern nursing methods and promoted the recognition of nursing as a respected profession. The world's highest award to a nurse today is the Florence Nightingale Medal. After a long siege, Sebastopol was taken by the Allies in 1855, and the war was ended by the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1856. The treaty provided for the demilitarization of the Black Sea. Neither Russia nor Turkey was allowed to have a fleet of ships in the Black Sea. The position of the British Empire was strengthened again, and the Russian Black Sea Fleet was rebuilt only 16 years later. At the end of the century, from 1899 and to 1901, Britain waged a war in South Africa, known as the Boer War. The presence of British emigrants in the two Dutch Boer republics, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, and the question of their civic rights under the Boer rule worsened Anglo-Boer relations. In 1899, the Boers under Kruger, the Transvaal president, declared war on Britain. It was the first war overseas that split the public opinion. Moreover, public opinion in Europe and America turned against Britain because Britain opened the first internment camps during the Boer War. The Boer War led to a demand for army reform and to a reaction against imperialism. You can now watch a documentary about the Boer War.
This is the Gordon Highlanders, led by pipers, leaving the Boer War in 1900. Note this Sergeant Major dealing with the young lads who get in the way of the camera, including one who gets a very nasty whack on the head. Despite the patriotic enthusiasm, General Buller, the first Commander-in-Chief, suffered a series of defeats. Colenso, the son of Lord Roberts, was killed. So Buller was replaced by Lord Roberts himself. With him went, as Chief of Staff, Lord Kitchener. Between them, they won. This is their triumphant return home, recorded at Southampton. First, the Guard of Honour, by men themselves returning from the Boer War in those characteristic helmets. One with the plumes, the bottom of the picture is Lord Roberts. Now in the centre of the picture is Chief of Staff, Lord Kitchener. And as they board their coach, we get a better view of them. Lord Roberts first, and that face that became so familiar in the days of the First World War, saying, "Your country needs you." Lord Kitchener on the right. Scenes at the front include this picture of General Buller's transport train of ox teams. The oxen organised and driven by Zulus. It was filmed in 1900, and now we actually are in South Africa. Part of the early British failure was the primitive nature of the transport and the dreadful terrain to which the troops were totally unaccustomed. In the days before the internal combustion engine, army transport was, to say the least, basic. Even the tank had yet to
Well, the Boer War was won by Britain, and the two Dutch republics became part of the British Empire. But Queen Victoria did not live to celebrate the victory. She died in 1901, and her death marked the end of an age, Britain's summer. But now, we're going to return to the middle of the 19th century, the time when Queen Victoria was still alive, and have a look at the development of Britain's industry and science. Victoria's reign saw the rapid industrialization of Britain and a vast growth of national wealth, which was reflected in the imperialism of the late 19th century. Britain became the strongest colonial power of the late 19th century. Its trade with colonies flourished throughout the century. British businessmen wanted to buy cheap and sell dear, but they were blocked by various preferences granted to colonial produce, and thus foreign markets were growing more important than colonial. The development of industrial production and trade stimulated the development of transport. The railroad network more than doubled during the mid-Victorian years. There we are. First look at the empire map, and then at the railway map. And although originally the railroads were built to carry goods, they also catered for passengers. The number of passengers carried annually increased 7 times by the middle of the 19th century. A boom in steamship building began in the 1860s. The value of British exports went up 3 times, and overseas capital investments increased 4 times. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held at Crystal Palace in London, was the world's first fair and symbolized Britain's industrial supremacy. Even working-class living standards improved. The growth of trade unionism led to the establishment of the Trades Union Congress in 1868. The Victorian age, as I've already said, was the peak of the so-called English summer. And not only due to the industrial development and colonial expansion of the country. It was also the age of rapid development of science. Michael Faraday and Charles Darwin are 2 of the most distinguished figures in the history of British science. In 1857, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. His theory of evolution, based upon scientific observation, was welcomed by many as proof of mankind's ability to find a scientific explanation to everything. But for religious people, who made up the majority of the middle class, the idea that all living beings, including human beings, had developed from simpler creatures was intolerable. And it finally led to a crisis in the church. The battle between faith and reason lasted for the rest of the century. The country's developing economy needed skilled workers, technicians, and engineers to meet the demands of the growing industrial centers. From the 1870s to the 1890s, several education acts were passed by Parliament. In 1817, schooling was made compulsory. This is a typical red brick 19th century school, which still functions in London. All children up to the age of 13 were supposed to go to school, where they were taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and sometimes elementary science. In Scotland, there had been a state education system since the time of the Reformation. There were 4 Scottish universities, and 3 of them dated from the Middle Ages. In Wales, schools had begun to grow rapidly in the middle of the 19th century, partly for nationalist reasons. But by the middle of the century, Wales had a university and a smaller university college. And then the government began to build red brick universities in the new industrial centers. The term red brick distinguished the new universities and schools, which were usually built of red brick, from older, mostly stone-built universities of Oxford and Cambridge. The new universities had a more pragmatic approach to education and taught more science and technology to feed Britain's industries. Now let us speak about social life in the country. From the early 1850s to the early 1870s, with occasional years of high unemployment and business failure, almost all sections of the population seemed to be benefiting from relative prosperity. Profits rose, and so did wages and incomes from land. Indeed, those supporters of protection who had argued in the 1840s that free trade would ruin British agriculture were marked by the mid-Victorian prosperity of agriculture. It was during those years that Victorianism came to represent a cluster of moral attributes such as character, duty, will, earnestness, hard work, and respectable behavior. Those virtues were not only necessary, and they were not only appreciated by the striving bourgeoisie, but all of them made an appeal to other class sections of the population, aristocratic or trade unionist. But in spite of that, there was always a Victorian underworld. Belief in the family was accompanied by the spread of prostitution. And in every large city there were districts where every Victorian value was ignored. Many Victorians were eager to read about crime rather than read the Bible. The late Victorian period was taken generally, considered to be the time of security, the age of house parties and long weekends in the country. Different variants of socialist theories spread in Great Britain, including Marxism. And London remained the financial, political, and cultural center of Britain. Moreover, it was one of the country's industrial centers. You can now watch an extract from an old documentary showing London at the end of the 19th century.
Hyde Park Corner, London, in 1898. This was part of the first ever London horse bus route in 1829. Note the nifty hansom cabs, the taxis of the day. One of them makes a brisk left-hand turn. Westminster Bridge in 1896 with the Houses of Parliament in the background. Tower Bridge, again in May 1896. A fine assembly of horse-drawn traffic. Hand carts, coal carts, hansom cabs, and those very important gentlemen, the crossing sweepers, who not only kept the roads clean, but also assisted the general passage of the traffic. The speed of the traffic is so slow that a man with a handcart can easily keep pace. In Victorian times, groups of minstrels were a common sight in the streets, and once again, it's 1896. Piccadilly Circus, still in that magic first 5 years of the movies. Building on the right, by the way, is still recognizable today. Notice the large number of street lamps, all needed because of the dim nature of gaslight. Eros can just about be glimpsed from the top left-hand side of the screen, but only just.
The Victorian age also gave rise to a new trend in literature, and we are now turning to literature. So that new trend was critical realism. The best-known poets of the period were Alfred Tennyson, Robert Browning, and Robert Louis Stevenson. Well, that is Robert Louis Stevenson, whom we all mostly know as the writer of adventure books, but he was also a poet. And that is Alfred Tennyson. Alfred Tennyson made his mark very early with poems chiefly lyrical, which were published in 1830, and then a book of poems which was published in 1832. In his early work, Tennyson brought wonderful lyric gift to late romantic subject matter, but in the major poems of his middle period, he combined the larger scale required by his new ambitions with his original gift, or the brief lyric, by building long poems out of short ones. You can now listen to one of his poems.
Alfred Lord Tennyson, The Lady of Shalott.
On either side the river lie long fields of barley and of rye that clothe the world and meet the sky. And through the field the road runs by to many-towered Camelot. And up and down the people go, gazing where the lilies blow round an island there below, the island of Shalott. Willows whiten, aspens quiver, little breezes dusk and shiver through the wave that runs forever by the island in the river, flowing down to Camelot. 4 grey walls and 4 grey towers overlook a space of flowers, and the silent isle embowers the Lady of Shalott.
That's it. But the dominant form of literature during the Victorian period was the novel. Early Victorian literature includes some of the greatest and most popular novels ever written. Political novels, religious novels, historical novels, sporting novels, Irish novels, crime novels, and comic novels, they all flourished during the Victorian age. Most novelists of the period wrote long works with many elaborately worked out characters. Charles Dickens, the greatest master of the century, exhibited an astonishing ability to create living characters. His novels Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club, Great Expectations, and others put him among the best writers in world literature. His exposures of social evils and his powers of caricature and humor won him a vast readership during his lifetime, and he is widely read today. Even during his lifetime, Dickens became the national literary symbol of the country. He invented the theatre for one actor and gave public readings from his novels. Another master of characterization was William Makepeace Thackeray, the author of Vanity Fair. He was a popular writer working for the enlarged reading public of his day and especially for serial publications. Both authors were humorists, sentimentalists, and social satirists. But while Thackeray satirized romantic sentimentality and the snobbishness of upper-class life, Dickens wrote about the lower classes and social injustice. The 19th century saw a surprisingly big number of women writers who did not only write for pleasure but left a substantial trace in English literature. One of them was Jane Austen, the author of Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Emma. She had a witty mind and wrote about right judgment, right behavior, and the formation of character. Elizabeth Gaskell remains best known for the novel Mary Barton, in which she describes with realism and sympathy the lives of industrial and agricultural workers in the wake of the Chartist movement. George Eliot is the pen name of Mary Ann Evans. Her best-known novels are The Mill on the Floss and Silas Marner. Eliot was the first among the English novelists to develop an interest in factors that contribute to making people what they are. She was the first to analyze those factors and to show them at work. The idea is manifested in Silas Marner, which is a wonderful study of English provincial life, rural speech, and character. The famous Bronte sisters, Charlotte and Emily, who were brought up in poor surroundings, wrote the books which rank among the most popular novels of the century. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre describes the life of a poor and plain-looking girl who has a strong character and wins her happiness. Charlotte's sister, Emily Bronte, is the author of one of the greatest English novels, Wuthering Heights. In the opinion of some critics, no woman could have written it. The novel has been compared to Shakespeare's King Lear, chiefly because of its immense and uncontrolled passions. We are now going to watch an extract from Jane Eyre.
Edwards,
to stay. Helen, cut your hair. Helen, are you awake? It's morning. Helen!
Well, this is an old version of Jane Eyre, a screen version, but although it is not as beautiful and glamorous as the new one, it better renders the Victorian atmosphere that existed at the time. Now, the Irish-born intellectual Oscar Wilde was a poet, a writer, and a dramatist. He led an eccentric life that fueled his witty satires and epigrams on Victorian society. As a member of the aesthetic movement in literature, Wilde advocated the idea of art for art's sake. His works include 2 collections of fairy stories, the only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, a few poems, and 4 comedies. Lady Windermere's Fan, A Woman of No Importance, An Ideal Husband, and The Importance of Being Earnest. The plays sparkle with clever paradoxes and witty dialogues. Well, watch for yourselves.
What do you mean, Algy, by Cecily? I don't know anyone of the name of Cecily. Do you mean to say that you had my cigarette case all this time? I wish to goodness you'd let me know. I've been writing frantic letters to Scotland Yard about it. I was very nearly offering a large reward.
Well, I wish you would offer one. I happen to be more than usually hard up.
No good offering a large reward, and that's the thing is found.
I think that's rather mean of you, Ernest, I must say. However, it makes no matter. Now that I look at the inscription, I find that the thing isn't yours after all.
Well, of course it's mine. You've seen me with it 100 times. You have no right whatsoever to read what is written inside. It is a very ungentlemanly thing to read a private cigarette case.
It's perfectly absurd to have a hard and fast rule about what one should read and what one shouldn't read. More than half of modern culture depends on what one shouldn't read.
I'm quite aware of the fact, and I don't propose to discuss modern culture with you. That isn't the sort of thing one should talk of in private. I simply want my cigarette case back.
Yes. But this isn't your cigarette case. This cigarette case is a present from someone of the name of Cecily. You said that you didn't know anyone of that name.
Well, if you want to know, Cecily happens to be my aunt.
Your aunt?
Yes. Charming old lady she is too. Lives at Tunbridge Wells.
But why does she call herself Cecily if she is your aunt and lives in Tunbridge Wells? From little Cecily, with her fondest love.
My dear fellow, what on earth is that in that? Some aunts are tall, some aunts are not tall. That is surely a matter that an aunt may be allowed to decide for herself. Oh, for heaven's sake, give me back my cigarette case.
Yes, but why does your aunt call you her uncle? From little Cecily, with her fondest love, to her her dear Uncle Jack. There is no objection, I admit, to an aunt being a small aunt. But why an aunt, no matter what her size may be, should call her own nephew her uncle, I can't quite make out. Besides, your name isn't Jack at all, it is Ernest.
It isn't Ernest, it's Jack.
You have always told me it was Ernest. You're the most earnest-looking person I ever saw in my life. Absolutely absurd, you saying your name isn't Ernest. Well, it's on your cards. Here is one of them. Mr. Ernest Worthing, B4, the Albany. I shall keep this as a proof that your name is Ernest, if ever you attempt to deny the fact to me, to Gwendolen, or to anyone else.
Well, my name is Ernest in town and Jack in the country, and the cigarette case was given me in the country.
Yes, but that still doesn't account for the fact that your small Aunt Cecily, who lives in Tunbridge Wells, calls you her dear uncle. Go on, old boy, I'm not going to have the thing out at once.
My dear Elsie, you talk exactly like a dentist. I may mention that I have always suspected, and now I am quite sure, that you are a confirmed and secret Bunburyist. Bunburyist? Now, what on earth do you mean by Bunburyist?
I will reveal to you the meaning of that incomparable expression when you are kind enough to tell me why you are Ernest in town and Jack in the country.
Well, produce my cigarette case first.
Here it is. Now produce your explanation, and pray make it improbable.
There's nothing improbable about my explanation at all. Old Mr. Thomas Cardew, who adopted me when I was a little boy, made me in his will guardian to his granddaughter, Miss Cecily Cardew. Cecily, who addresses me as uncle out of motives of respect, which you could not possibly appreciate, lives at my place in the country under the charge of her admirable governess, Miss Prism.
Where is that place in the country, by the way?
That is nothing to you, dear boy. You are not going to be invited. I may tell you candidly that it is not in Shropshire.
I suspected that. I have Bunburyed all over Shropshire on 2 separate occasions. Now go on.
When one is placed in the position of guardian, one has to adopt a very high moral tone on all subjects. It is one's duty to do so. And as a high moral tone can hardly be said to conduce very much to either one's health or one's happiness. In order to get up to town, I have always pretended to have a younger brother of the name of Ernest, who lives here in the Albany and who gets into the most dreadful scrapes. That, my dear Algy, is the whole truth.
Oh, no. What you really are is a Bunburyist. I was perfectly right in saying you were a Bunburyist. You're one of the most advanced Bunburyists I know.
What on earth do you mean?
You have invented a very useful younger brother called Ernest, in order that you may be able to come up to London as often as you like. I have invented an invaluable permanent invalid called Bunbury, in order that I may be able to go down to the country whenever I choose. Bunbury really is invaluable. If it wasn't for Bunbury's extraordinary bad health, for instance, I wouldn't be able to dine with you at Willis's tonight. But I've really been engaged to dine at Aunt Augusta's for more than a week.
I haven't asked you to dine with me anywhere tonight.
I know, you are absurdly careless about sending out invitations. It's very foolish of you. Nothing annoys people more than not receiving invitations.
That's it. And now let's finally speak about the development of art in Victorian Britain. In the middle of the century, in 1848, a group of 7 young men, led by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, formed the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, or the PRB. They aimed to revolutionize British art by painting serious subjects directly from nature and do it with vivid realism and detail. Their chosen name reflected their wish to return to the sincerity and simplicity of the artists of the Middle Ages. Their subjects were to tackle modern social problems: drink, prostitution, gambling, and so on. They often had a religious message, as in Holman Hunt's picture, The Awakening Conscience. The young woman in the picture is the kept mistress of the man. She had just jumped up from her lover's lap and is staring out of the window at the brilliant light, which we can see reflected in the large mirror behind her. The light seems to symbolize Christ, and Hunt's title, I repeat, The Awakening Conscience, the title indicates that she has had a crisis of conscience and has realized the moral horror of her situation. The Pre-Raphaelites illustrated history, mythology, and literature, and they brought a new concern for truth of life and human psychology. Next time we are going to speak about 20th century Britain. Thank you.